The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you, and this episode is also supported by the Veritas Forum podcast. For 30 years, the Veritas Forum has been bringing Christian faith into dialogue with other beliefs at top universities around the world. And guess what? They have a podcast. You like podcasts, don't you? This season, the Veritas Forum podcast is asking the question, what does it mean to be human? Each week, you'll hear from top scholars like James K.A. Smith, Alan Noble, Megan Sullivan, and John Lennox. If you want to engage your heart and your mind around the ideas that shape your life, check out these conversations on the Veritas Forum podcast. Search for the Veritas Forum podcast, that's Veritas, wherever you listen to podcasts. And now for the show.
Welcome to the Holy Post. Everyone is suddenly talking about Christian nationalism. Some on the right are embracing the label, while others on the left are condemning it. This week, we talk about Bart Barber, the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention, who was interviewed on 60 Minutes, who explained why Christian nationalism is fundamentally anti-Baptist. But Al Mohler, another influential SBC leader, is less eager to condemn Christian nationalism and takes a more nuanced approach. He also says that Christians who don't vote for the Republican Party are being unfaithful to God. We unpack his argument. Then I interview Georgetown professor Paul Miller about his new book, The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? Miller defines it historically and explains why Christian nationalism is both anti-American and anti-Christian. All of that, plus drunk animal news from Australia. Here is episode 531.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. This is Phil Fisher. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil. How you doing?
Good. Who was it last week? Skye said hi to everybody.
I did, and you took offense,
yeah,
which is why I specifically said hi to you
Caitlin said hi to
time.
me. Okay, so I appreciate that. You're a learning organism. That's good. It's good to be a learner, a lifelong learner. And Christian's here, too, who always... I don't have to correct her. She just does everything right. Unlike
That's not true.
Unlike that. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Hey, do either of you know what Blender is? Are you familiar with Blender? Christian, you know what Blender is?
I do.
Is that another dating app?
Oh, it does sound like it, doesn't it?
It does sound
That's
like
what I
one.
make my smoothies in.
Oh, yeah, there's that too. It's computer animation software, 3D software. And I'm doing something fun because I actually have, I'm right now working, I'm on a retainer to consult with a big Christian ministry about kids products, but they don't have anything for me to do right now. So I have some downtime. So I've been I decided I want to see how much computer animation has developed since I last animated in 1996. That was when I last animated.
Ooh, that should be fun for you.
So how much has changed with software in 26 years? Can you even picture what Microsoft Word looked like in the mid 1990s?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Windows 95.
Yeah.
Which a lot's changed, Phil.
And I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but back then, computer animation consisted of you taking several different things and putting them together in order to create new organisms that never existed and that couldn't have arms and feet.
Kind of. Yeah.
Right?
Sure. We'll go with that. There was all these things that were really hard to do, and then we just tried to find workarounds to do them. And so I thought, I wonder how much it's changed. And I was going to buy one of the professional packages, but it was really expensive. I was like, I don't want to spend that much. And I remember, there's this thing called Blender. Blender is open source. It's crowd developed. It's free. You don't have to pay for it. And I hear it's getting pretty good. So I downloaded it. If any of you ever played with Blender out there, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I've spent 2 weeks playing with it. Every about 10 minutes saying, and my wife will vouch for this, saying, oh my gosh, because it's so easy.
This is also why you haven't been responding to emails and messages.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
You guys have been slacking me, and I'm slacking off. Is that where that term comes from? Because you don't go to your Slack channel often enough? Is that why they came up with that term 50 years ago or 100 years ago? Maybe. I'll let you discuss that later, and I'll get back to my story. So anyway, I'm playing around with Blender, and I'm having so much fun because I forgot how much I actually like 3D animation, because it's this combination of art and math and science that, if you have a weird right and left side brain together, like to play together at the same time, you love computer animation. And it's given me ideas for like new things to do. So I'm trying to take Buck Denver and then replicate him as a 3D animated character and to see what that would look like and how hard it would be to animate. So the reason I'm bringing this up is I may actually want to interact with some other people who use Blender. So if you're out there in the audience and you're a Blender jockey, go to LinkedIn and look me up on LinkedIn and send me a little message because I want to meet you. Okay. LinkedIn, but don't everybody go to LinkedIn and click. That'd be too many people. If you don't know Blender, don't reach out to me on LinkedIn. Okay, promise. Okay. Christian, have you been anywhere? 2 weeks.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have. This has been a really challenging time for my family. My husband lost his brother very suddenly at 48 years old, and
oh man.
So I had to go to the visitation in Maryland, and then a week later the burial in Indiana. So
oh man,
it was not fun traveling, and
no, it's not.
Yeah, but I do have fun traveling coming up.
Okay.
I am going to be going to New York and Atlanta and Washington, D.C. for screenings. And the one in D.C. is at the French Embassy, and everyone's invited. So if you're in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, follow me on Twitter and you'll see the invite to buy tickets to see the Girl Who Wore Freedom at the French Embassy.
All right. And we will commit to pray for your husband and his family.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of thinking about death and the end times. As if you listen to Christian Asks, I asked Skye some of those questions, which Skye really appreciated that.
Okay.
But that was before your brother-in-law passed, wasn't it?
I think it was, you know what? It was Skye because I had another friend pass before him. But if you guys haven't signed on to Patreon, you're just now listening to this, maybe you're one of the few new followers Phil has. Their Patreon is pretty awesome. Twitter. There is lots of interesting extra stuff on Patreon, and one of them is where I get to ask Skye questions. So.
Yeah, just to elaborate a little bit more, usually Christian and I will do 2 episodes of Christian Asks every month. I do 2 episodes of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess every month, and we have bonus interviews from many of our guests. So, and plus a lot of other stuff. Holy Post Book Club, live streams, exclusive merch.
Oh, baby.
It's a fun town party.
Oh, baby. You can't miss out.
All the cool kids are there.
Okay, so something happened that we just have to talk about because it's kind of amazing. And it's animal news. It's an animal news. It's a story from Australia. It's a story from Australia. It actually happened a couple...
They've got the weirdest animals.
They do have the weirdest animals. It actually happened a couple of years ago, but I just found out about it, and it's so significant that we have to talk about it. Pig steals 18 beers, gets drunk, fights cow.
What?
Okay.
Please elaborate.
Yes, this is fantastic. A feral pig, a wild pig in Australia, came to a campsite. People were camping out. People, campers, they have beer. One campsite had 3 6-packs of beer that they had left outside. They awoke to crunching noises. You may think, how does a pig drink a beer in a can? Did you ever wonder that?
I do.
Yeah, like a fraternity guy.
You smash it on your forehead?
Yeah, they just smash it open and drink it from the side of the can.
Or maybe they just poke a hole, and stick it up and then just suck it all down.
Yeah, the pig or the frat boy?
Well, both.
Oh, both. Yeah. So pigs aren't good at opening cans. So apparently the pig was just chewing the cans and drinking whatever he could and went through all 3 6-packs. All 3 6-packs of beer.
Clearly liking beer.
Not sure how much of the beer actually ended up in the pig as opposed to all over the table and whatever else. But the pig drank the beer, got intoxicated, and then went and picked a fight with a cow. And campers found him being chased by the cow, the angry cow that he'd picked a fight with. He was now running from it. Then the pig jumped in a river. Oh, that's almost biblical. Swam about halfway out into the river, turned around, swam back, and then he went to a tree, went under a tree, and passed out.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's
Doesn't
beautiful.
It does sound like a fraternity hazing of some sort, doesn't it?
Yeah, because even with fraternities, they do cow tipping sometimes.
Oh, yeah. That's what he was trying to do. Now I got to go tip a cow. Oh, no. This cow. This cow's not correct. It made me think of, because pigs are really intelligent, right? They're like, we've all learned since Babe how intelligent pigs are and that you can train them to do all sorts of things. It made me wonder if it's a new like level for an animal to get to be at the status where they can say, hold my beer and watch this. That's basically what he did.
I'll tell you, the part of the story that makes me feel somewhat relieved is that the pig got intoxicated on its own.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like some
Part of
farmer.
part of a lab experiment.
Exactly. Where people did terrible things to this animal.
Yeah.
The animal
Yeah.
did something to itself. And that makes me feel like laughing at this is okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's totally okay. Right. He brought
and
it
was
on
the pig,
himself.
I forgot how the story ended because I saw this online.
The next
ended
day
badly?
or a couple days later, the pig got hit by a car. They found the pig.
Seriously?
Yeah, roadkill.
Oh, that makes
Don't know
me
if he had a
sad.
hangover or if it would have happened anyway, even if he hadn't drunk 3 6-packs of Australian beer. Yeah,
Bummer.
but feral pigs are an invasive species in Australia, and they cause problems to the natural habitat. So, okay, that's enough of that. It's fun, though. Wasn't as fun. It's a fun story. I just love the headlines. One of my favorite headlines of all time. Pig drinks beer, gets drunk, pigs fight with cow. Steals beer. Pig steals beer because pigs can't buy beer. They don't have state-issued ID.
Sounds like a great idea for like an Australian children's book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Somebody, Michael Bird can get on that. Or we've got a number of Australian friends who could get on that. John Dixon could get on that as well. Christian nationalism will lead to Christian persecution, SBC President Bart Barber warns. So Bart Barber is the new president of the SBC. He was voted in a couple months ago. He did an interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes.
Ooh, he's brave.
I don't understand how Anderson Cooper can be on CNN and 60 Minutes. Aren't they like rivals?
No, they're both owned by CNN is owned by Warner Brothers. No, CNN is owned by Turner. Yeah, Turner was owned by. Maybe they are.
Yeah, Warner Brothers.
Yeah,
but CBS
is 60 Minutes. CBS is Viacom, and so that's weird. That's like doing, Al Michaels doing 2 sports on 2 different networks. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, that's not the story, Skye. The story is not why is Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. Maybe his mom got him on there before she passed. Gloria Vanderbilt. That's his mom, the gene magnet. You don't remember those genes from...
Let's move along. Keep going.
Okay, sorry.
No, before my time.
Sorry. So he was on the show, had a fairly long segment interview with him, and I thought he did pretty well. Do you think he did pretty well?
I did. I was impressed. And I wonder if part of the reason he was as straightforward and honest as he was is because he's the pastor of a church, they said, of about 300 in Texas, which I suspect if he had been leading a massive mega church, he would have learned not to be as direct and honest.
Yeah, so he didn't, he described Christian nationalism as contrary to 400 years of Baptist history and everything I believe about religious liberty. Now, that's true. If any group in American Christianity would be more opposed to a national church, it would be Baptists who've been, just hounded and chased around the world for going against national churches. At one point,
Roger Williams is like one of the first Baptists in America, and he was the originator of our modern understandings of religious liberty.
Did he found all the churches that are called First Baptist?
No, but he did found the state of Rhode Island, or the colony of Rhode Island, and it was the first government charter that officially separated the church and state anywhere in the Western world.
Oh my gosh.
And he was a Baptist. So this is core to Baptist belief that these things should be separate.
I wonder of all the kind of pro Christians should take over the government or dominionism folks, what percentage are Southern Baptist? I'm going to assume it's not very big, if that honestly is the Baptist intellectual heritage.
Yeah, but that begs the question, how many Southern Baptists are actually formed in the theology and doctrine of the Southern Baptist Convention, and how many of them are just vanilla evangelical, YouTube watching conspiracy theorists, online prophecy followers?
Some. Christian, you grew up around Southern Baptists.
I was actually went to a Southern Baptist church till I was about 13.
Okay. And did you ever hear the teaching of strict separation between church and state because of our Baptist heritage?
I did not hear any of that, but I was too busy doing Bible sword drills and Girls in Action.
What's Girls in Action? That sounds inappropriate.
It's a Christian dance troupe.
Girls in Action, people loving with compassion. I don't remember the song. Do you guys remember this?
No, I don't. Why would I know that song? I was
know.
never a girl in action.
I loved Girls in Action.
Okay. So
Christian mission, Christian action. Oh, it's coming back to me.
Oh,
yeah. I loved my growing up in a Southern Baptist church. It was sweet.
Okay. So Anderson Cooper asked him about Donald Trump and quoted something that Bart Barber said in 2016, talking about candidate Trump at the time. He said, "I think it hurts the credibility of my testimony to be a vocal supporter of a demonstrably evil man whose campaign platform consists mainly of his evilness."
And he stood by that. He didn't back down.
That's a direct statement. That's even more strong than Al Mohler was in 2016.
And he hasn't been fired yet?
No, he just got hired like 2 months ago. But, and this is interesting, he voted for Trump in 2020. He confessed, and I think it was because it maybe was going better than he thought it would have gone, and that conservatives were accomplishing more of their policy goals than he thought. So it sounds like it was 2016 was principled and 2020 was more pragmatic.
Yeah, he did say that by 2020 he was, I don't know what his exact quote was, but something along the lines of that Trump had been more consistent on the pro-life platform than he had expected, and that was important to him. But then he said in light of January 6, 2021, that was completely inconsistent with Christian values. An angry mob storming the Capitol is not the way of Jesus. And he didn't. And then he was asked about 2024 and whether he would support Donald Trump, and he kind of was evasive then.
Yeah, he said he now represents 50,000 churches, and he cannot speak to things like that.
Which was a little bit disappointing, because he could have easily have said, the Southern Baptist Convention is a very diverse group of people that has a lot of different political points of view, and lots of Southern Baptists probably would vote for Donald Trump, but I stand by my conviction that he's evil, and I would not support him. I would prefer a different conservative candidate.
Yeah, but
he didn't say that. He just kind of dodged the whole
2020.
question.
Apparently he got over the evil thing in 2020, so he can't now appeal to that again. So we would have to appeal to he supported a mob, attacking the Capitol, and that's evil of a new kind.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I mean, maybe it was edited out of the interview, but it's pretty hard when in 2016 you call someone evil to then say, well, but I'll vote for him in 2020, and I'm not going to rule him out in 2024, because what you're implying there is that whoever he's running against is even more evil. It's the lesser of two evils argument.
Right. Okay.
One other thing, Phil, on that, before we move on. He was also very clear that the election in 2020 was not stolen.
That is true.
Joe Biden is the legitimate president, and he prays for him regularly. And they had Ryan Burge on to talk about how, I think he said 60% of evangelicals, white evangelicals, still believe the election was stolen. So for the president of the SBC to flat out say it wasn't, puts him at odds with probably a significant chunk of his own constituency.
Yeah.
But I was really glad and proud that he did that, and shows that he's got some integrity and character, where he's not just beholden to the whims of the base.
Right. He seems to be holding the presidency loosely, not like it's, his life's goal to be president of the SBC, but that he's here for a season to try to help with the abuse scandals and try to bring some sanity. And if he gets kicked out, he'll just go back to his little church in Texas.
Yeah, and again, I think it's because he doesn't have a megachurch with thousands of people that he has to appease all the time.
This isn't going to affect his book sales.
Right.
I didn't get to see this, or any follow-up from it. How did people respond, like people in the Southern Baptist world, respond to his interview? Do you know?
I haven't seen anything on that.
Well, it just aired last night, right? So it's pretty early.
Oh yeah, it was Sunday. It was yesterday. So
right.
we don't know yet.
Well,
we don't know yet. We'll wait. We'll update you in the future about that. We need to talk about another Southern Baptist. Southern Baptists are in the news. There's a podcast New York Times puts out called The Run Up, which is a weekly podcast they've done before each, for 8-10 weeks before each election for the last couple of elections. This season, before the midterms, is hosted by, I wrote down his name. Hosted by Asted Herndon, an African-American man whose father taught at Wheaton College for a while. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the topic of this whole episode, this is worth looking up. Y'all.
We'll link in the show notes.
We'll link it in the show notes because it's worth listening. It's like a 40-minute episode entirely about kind of the state of evangelicals in America from the New York Times. But the first little over half, he is talking to Ruth Graham, a Wheaton College graduate who now writes for the New York Times as their religion reporter, their primary religion reporter. She's really sharp. So they talk just about what's going on with evangelicals. And that part is interesting. But the second part, he interviews Al Mohler. Al Mohler is one of the biggest figures in the Southern Baptist Convention. He's the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of the biggest seminaries in the world, and the biggest Southern Baptist, kind of the flagship Southern Baptist Seminary. He's been a candidate for president of the SBC. He has a daily podcast that's even more popular than ours. It's above. We don't have the audience that he has for his podcast. So, and he has been in the news. He was in the news for not liking Donald Trump in 2016, but then finding a way to like him in 2020. He was in the news most recently for saying at a conservative event in Georgia that Christians have to vote, and if you vote wrong, you're being unfaithful to God.
Wow.
Did he
Did you hear that, Christian, when that happened?
Oh, wow, I did not. This is new news to me.
And we all know how he votes, but did he specify exactly what a faithful vote looks like?
Not in that conversation, but in this one he did.
Okay.
So
right.
it was at a conservative event. So you could kind of read between the lines, saying voting wrong is not voting for the conservative candidate, the Republican candidate. So he agreed to do an interview with Asted Herndon, which was quite interesting. It's about a 20-minute interview, so it's a more in-depth interview than you're going to find if he pops up on CNN or Fox News or someplace. And he asks him a lot of these questions about Trump and about what you said, and did you really mean that? And why are you coming out so? And it was a good window into this, the kind of thinking that says, these are the only issues that matter. Which issues are the ones that matter? And this is how I can say it is wrong for you to vote as a Christian for a Democrat. So it was a pretty good elaboration of that point of view, Skye.
We've talked about this before, but what really annoys me about this is essentially
I haven't even said anything about him yet, and you're already annoyed.
I am annoyed because what he's communicating is, even if you agree with me 100% on all of these different policies and moral issues and theological things, we can agree 100%. But if you don't prioritize those topics in the same order I do,
yes,
you are sinning against God.
Yes.
So again, we can agree on everything.
Yes.
It's the prioritization of things that matters most.
Yes,
which seems kind of insane. Where does Christian liberty come into this?
Oh, no. Skye. That Christian liberty means you can go to whichever church you want. It doesn't mean you can vote your conscience.
Well, I don't think he would agree with you can go to within every church you want either.
Within the SBC. I don't know okay, so here's another thing he said is that he's not going to, and he said this in the news earlier, and who interviewed him? Ested asked him to explain. He said he's not going to run away from the Christian nationalist title, where Bart Barber just said Christian nationalism is unchristian. Although going back to Bart Barber for just a second, one of the things that I thought, could have done that maybe differently. His argument against Christian nationalism was that ultimately it ends up targeting people like him, Baptists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't understand that.
Well, yeah, which is true, because if there's, through history, it was the Church of England persecuting Baptists, and then in the colonies, it was Puritans or Quakers or other groups, Congregationalists persecuting Baptists. So, but it's kind of like saying, I recognize the only way to get my people to change their mind is to appeal to their self-interest.
So what bothered me about that point of his is it sounded like he was saying we would actually be okay with Christian nationalism if it only hurt other people. But because it might backfire and hurt us, we should also be against it, which is not a very Christian ethic.
Yeah, well, he said, it stands contrary to 400 years of Baptist history and everything I believe about religious liberty. But I think he recognizes that's not an argument that wins over many Southern Baptists these days. He needs an argument that's a little more self-centered.
But, wouldn't it have been better if he had said, I'm against Christian nationalism or the interplay of faith and the church and the government because I believe in the dignity of all people created in the image of God who should have freedom of conscience to worship and believe what they want, because in such an environment, we also as Christians will be free to express our faith and persuade others. And we believe that in a free market environment like that, more people will come to understand who Jesus is and follow him. We don't need the government's help to make Christianity appealing. That's
not a very good soundbite, Skye. The easier soundbite is, this will be bad for you in the long run. So,
well, that's why I'm not president of the SBC, I guess.
Vote your self-interest. Yes, Christian.
So, in a few things that I've read recently, there seems to be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of embracing and pride in the term Christian nationalism and justifying why it's right. But that seems to be something really new. Is that true?
Yes,
and on both counts?
It's really new, and what I'm noticing is a desire to redefine it. In the same way we redefine woke or CRT to be something, clearly evil and that all good people must be against, we can redefine Christian nationalism to be clearly good and something all good Christian people should be for. And the alternate definition, the alternate facts are that Christian nationalism simply means you want your nation to promote good, healthy Christian values like love of neighbor.
And that was Al Mohler's point.
Want that?
His point in not disavowing the label was all about definition. He said if by Christian nationalist you simply mean a conservative Christian who's pro-life and advocates for those policies in the public square, then he's not going to disavow Christian nationalism. But if you mean somebody who thinks literally the church ought to be in charge of the government, and, then he'd say, that's not who I am. So if he was squishy on, but it was also a loophole for him to not lose the support of people who are embracing the Christian nationalist label.
Right. But my assumption is
Go ahead.
My assumption is he would not do the same linguistic gymnastics with the term white supremacist. If
not.
By white supremacist you mean that I think, white people have done a lot of good in the world, then I cannot disavow the name. But this is something where, it's become such a slang from the left that I don't want to sound like I'm joining in with the slangery.
Yeah, our interview later in this episode is with Paul Miller, who wrote a whole book about Christian nationalism from a sort of academic point of view. And he makes the point, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but he argues the word nationalism has been around for a long time, and it has an actual definition. And you can't just now decide we're going to change that to make it more palatable and compatible with Christianity. And that's the problem here is Mohler and others want to redefine nationalism to be something that's not that unattractive. But it is. It's a terrible thing.
Well, I mean, and if you go back to, I mean, I brought this up a long time ago, what C.S. Lewis wrote in The Four Loves, where he talks about love of country. He doesn't use the word Christian nationalism, but he does talk about sort of that misplaced, misguided patriotism that we're seeing today as being outside what Christ calls us to.
Yeah, yeah. So I found the interview with Mohler fascinating because it gave him an opportunity to really articulate some of the positions he's taken. So here's the basic flow of what he said. The country's being taken over by secularism. Secularism says Christians are out of step with the culture. And when he was pushed on, what do you mean out of step with the culture? What, in what sense do you mean? And he went back to the 1950s, something that no black Christians ever do. Point back to the 1950s and say, shouldn't things be that way again? Anyway, he said in the 1950s, the leadership of the SBC and the leadership of the nation would be seen as part of the same world, basically the same men, white men with the same white man values. They're part of the same world, Christian values. And now that's changed. And on a whole host of issues. And Onstead, that's not his name. Ernstead, I forgot his name, said, can you, what issues are you speaking of? He said, well, the most explosive issue is the sexuality issue. Entire alphabets have been developed since I started teaching in 1993. And so now the society disagrees with us. He said this flat out, he doesn't want a Christian church to be in charge of the U.S. government. He doesn't think there should be a religion test for people running for office. But the country needs to adhere to, the basic values that the founders wanted, which was human dignity and human rights. Those are the things he named, human dignity and human rights. And because of that, he believes, and this is where he gets to his voting recommendation, certain issues have to have primacy over all other issues. And those issues, he's come up with two issues that must have primacy over all issues, and it's the sanctity of human life, which he interprets as abortion, I think exclusively. He didn't talk about the death penalty. He didn't talk about euthanasia. He didn't talk about any other human life issues. Abortion and the integrity of marriage. And those are the two issues that he says, are prior to all other issues. Because of that, and because of the Democrats taking what he feels are anti-Christian positions on those two issues, the Democratic Party is incompatible with the Christian faith, and all Christians, faithful Christians, must vote Republican because of abortion and marriage, because we must have a majority of Republicans in the office to change the laws on abortion and marriage, which are prior to all other issues. Amen. God bless. Drive safe. We now know who to vote for.
Okay, that's perfect example of the point I was making earlier. Even if you believe that Al Mohler's views on abortion and marriage are the Orthodox Christian biblical interpretation of those issues, he gives no evidence that they are the most important issues, as opposed to other things like the existence of poverty, systemic racism, violence, guns, warfare. I mean, you go on down the list of all kinds of problems that the world is facing, but how can he claim that these are the two that God says are the most important?
That is my question, Skye. I was going to ask you that so you could explain it to me, because as my friend on Twitter said, the one that when I was interacting with first before the Babylon Bee swept in, you're saying abortion is, trumps all other issues. And he said abortion is way, double way more important than anything else. And I'm just curious how we got there.
Yeah, because, I mean, if you look at the Bible, you look at the New Testament, it seems like God cares a lot about the strangers and the immigrants in our land. And that wasn't even mentioned in the list at all.
Abortion and marriage integrity. That's what Jesus talks about.
Yeah.
Over and over.
What about widows and orphans?
How
they
different
need to get married and not have abortion.
How different is what he articulated from what you hear from, say, Pope Francis or just the Roman Catholic Church in general, which probably would agree with him on his stance on abortion and marriage. But then they have, of course, the seamless garment of life, that as they talk about this belief in the dignity of immigrants, caring for the poor, education, anti-racism. Multiple popes have spoken out about the perils of free market capitalism that's unregulated and the way it hurts people, nuclear proliferation. You go on down the list, including the dignity of the old, and they argue for anti-capital punishment, all these other, they have multiple issues that they say are all consistent with the Christian ethic of life and human dignity, but they don't then say only one political party is faithful to God, because no one political party captures all those issues in the way the church articulates them. But Mohler seems to have this blind spot to say, no, it's just these two, that's it, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
I just don't get that.
Yeah.
It does sound very, very much like what I heard when I was working in Washington in the 80s. Truly, as I was growing up, I did not think I was stunned when I met my first Christian Democrat. I didn't think those existed or were allowed to exist. So, it just feels like it's being said a lot more loudly and more clearly now.
And to one thing, just to be clear, I'm not saying a faithful Christian can't think and vote the way that Al Mohler is articulating. I think they can. But the idea that anybody who votes differently than I do or prioritizes these issues differently is suddenly not a faithful Christian, that's the step too far. It isn't that it's wrong to vote Republican necessarily because you care about these issues, but to demonize, diminish, and condemn those who don't vote the way you do as a brother or sister in Christ, that's the part that takes it too far.
Yeah. He did, in elaborating on marriage integrity, the justification, because there is very little in the Bible about, that talks about marriage, but just the structure of the family is not a huge focus. The Old Testament is full of polygamy, and concubines and all sorts of messes. And the New Testament mentions it for elders and, some household rules, which are a little bit broader than the way we interpret them. But it's not a huge focus of the Bible. But when he boiled it down to, this is why marriage integrity is one of the two issues that matter, is that it's the foundation of civilization.
But maybe he
which
has,
is not a biblical argument. That's not a biblical argument.
If he wants to be consistent, and maybe he has talked about this and I haven't heard it, but is he equally as opposed to no-fault divorce laws?
Yeah.
Which have been around since the 1960s in this country, depending on which state you're in, and arguably has done more to erode Christian marriage than gay marriage has?
We've got a story, a judge in New York just made a judgment that would give polyamorous relationships the same legal status as married and two people cohabitating relationships, basically elevating polyamory to the level of two-person marriages.
Right.
And
this is the slippery slope we've been hearing about for a long time.
I just want to go on the record and say, I'm not in favor of that. I just don't think that helps anybody, except the one third party in a polyamorous relationship who can't, his name isn't on the lease, and so they lose their apartment.
It also helps
solve that
divorce
problem
attorneys.
in different ways. Does?
Yeah,
because you got many more people to divorce.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm not saying I don't want there to be any, no laws to govern marriage and, throw out the traditional family. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, how did it get to be more important than anything else? And that's what I don't quite buy into.
Well, and I think to go back to Skye's point, I also don't think that you're singling out Al Mohler as he's the only one. I think you're probably trying to address a bigger issue, which is seem to be a lot of tribalism like this in the public square now, where if you don't believe exactly like this, then you are not a Christian or you are doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what we're trying to point out isn't a very healthy Christian way to think.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not trying to pick on Al Mohler, but he's a very public figure that represents the thinking of a very large group of Christians. And I found it very helpful to listen to him being interviewed by a not a Southern Baptist, not necessarily a friendly interviewer, although Herndon is very friendly with him. But it was interesting just to hear his arguments and hear the thinking kind of played out, under questioning, because he did a good job explaining his position, other than establishing how he came to the conclusion that these two issues are the issues that trump all other issues. Which,
what it reminds me of is you go back to the wars of religion in Europe, and you had people who, if we go back in time and we could interview them and ask them, do you all believe that Jesus is the Son of God? They say yes. Do you believe he died for your sins? Yes. Do you believe he bodily rose from the dead? Yes. But we're going to kill one another because we have a disagreement about what the bread and the wine really are at the moment of communion. Or, do you believe all these things? Yeah, we're all in agreement, but we're going to kill one another because we think babies should be baptized and they say adults should be baptized. And essentially what Al Mohler is saying is, if I have fellow Christians who agree with me on the divinity of Jesus, the authority of Scripture, the resurrection, the crucifixion, all these things, but you don't vote Republican, then you should be condemned. That it's that level of absurdity that you're making this thing, which isn't even as biblical as communion or baptism, the litmus test for faithfulness to Christ. Are you kidding me? That's the part I just find appalling. And talk about adding to the gospel. This is way outside the bounds of what should be considered acceptable judgment of a fellow Christian.
All right. We got to wrap it up. We got a guest talking more about Christian nationalism. It's a theme week. We're going to tell from beginning to end, except for the drunk pig stories. I want to have a drunk pig story every week. If anyone has any other drunk pig stories, please send them to me so that we can make this a recurring. And then I'll write a theme song. I will write a theme song about drunk pigs. Yeah, if someone can send me at least one more drunk pig story.
What about, maybe you just need to broaden it, Phil, to like alcohol and animals? Because recently we had that story about the woman who brought the raccoon into the bar.
Yes, that's true.
Maybe it's just alcohol and animals.
That may be
like
too many
that.
of those. I don't know. So send me what you can. Thanks, everybody. And stay around for the interview. Thank you, Patreon supporters. You help us keep the lights on and do lots of fun things. And we will see you all next week.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also supported by Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. Hey, this is Phil. So you want to grow in your faith and in your ministry. You don't want to repeat the mistakes you see in so much cultural Christianity, so you think you might need a stronger foundation in what the Bible actually teaches. And you're beginning to suspect it isn't going to come solely from YouTube videos and podcasts. Nothing against YouTube videos or podcasts, but you know. If this sounds like you, you should take a look at Biola University Talbot School of Theology's online programs. Talbot is a nationally recognized seminary committed to Christian doctrinal faithfulness and to the emotional and spiritual health of its students. Through Talbot's online programs, you'll receive personalized instruction and mentorship from nationally respected professors. Both live class sessions and pre-recorded lectures help you tailor an education to fit with your schedule. Let the Talbot School of Theology equip you to be the hands and feet of Jesus in your community. Visit biola.edu/Talbot for more information and to apply today. That's biola.edu/TALBOT.
As I already mentioned, my guest today is Dr. Paul D. Miller, professor in the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University. Earlier, he served in the U.S. Army, including tours in Afghanistan. He was an analyst for the CIA and the director of Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff. His new book is not about international affairs, but what's going on right here at home. The book is called The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? As you'll hear in our conversation, he took 6 years to really examine what was happening on the American home front and the way we are turning inward, particularly as conservative Christians, to redefine what it means to be an American, which then affects the way we look at the rest of the world. The book is the best I have found so far to really define what Christian nationalism is and why it is so problematic. And again, as you'll hear in our conversation, Dr. Miller is not writing as an outsider, but as a conservative Christian himself. As valuable as this conversation is, I wanted to also talk to Dr. Miller about foreign affairs. So if you are a Patreon supporter of the Holy Post, you can get a bonus conversation I have with him about what's going on in Ukraine and why he believes this is the most dangerous moment for the world since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a fascinating analysis of what's happening. Definitely check that out on Patreon. If you're not a supporter, go to holypost.com, click the Support Us button, and you'll get access to that bonus interview along with all the other bonus content we have on Patreon. Okay, here is Dr. Paul D. Miller. Paul Miller, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted you're here. You've written an incredible and helpful book at this moment, The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. Before we jump into some of the content of the book, I want our audience to get a better sense of your background. I probably introduced you already and talked about what you do and stuff, but you're talking about Christian nationalism not as an outsider throwing stones at evangelicals or from the left, but certainly as a conservative yourself. Early in the book, you mentioned having been a veteran in Afghanistan. You worked in the George W. Bush White House in national defense. You had CIA clearance. You grew up in a Baptist non-denominational church. You attended a Billy Graham crusade. You got married in an SBC church. And then one of my favorite quotes from your bio, you said, quote, "I hold old-fashioned views about sin, hell, and the exclusivity of Christianity's claims. I am proudly pro-life. I am a zealot for religious liberty. I served for several years as an elder at a small Baptist church in Texas. I love eating Chick-fil-A." Now, if that's not your bona fides as a conservative evangelical, I don't know what is. So I mention all that because I want to hear, why are you so concerned about what you've seen among white evangelicalism in recent years, and why write this whole book on Christian nationalism?
Thanks for the question and for the introduction. Why be so concerned about it? And why did I write the book? Well, around about 2016, okay, let me back up further. You know, I had this whole career in international affairs, which I still do. I teach this stuff at Georgetown. And a lot of what I think about is America's role in the world. Who are we as a country, and what role do we play in the world? But around about 2016, it became evident to me that we Americans don't agree on who we are, and thus we don't agree on what role we ought to play in the world. But I really wanted to dwell on sort of American identity. I also came to understand that I no longer understood or maybe belonged on the right. Still count myself a conservative, but I don't think the right is conservative. Turns out it's nationalist more than it is conservative. So I dug into these questions, read a lot of American history, a lot of political theory, just so I could kind of understand my country better, understand who we are, understand where we came from. And that does feed into my stuff on international affairs. But this book is really focused domestically. As a Christian, I became more concerned the more I read, because I saw a history of people using the name of Christianity to sell a political agenda that was not explicit in Scripture. It was at least extra-biblical, and there were some elements of it that I thought might actually be anti-biblical. And so that is why I grew more alarmed the more I read about nationalism.
Okay, so one of the big questions that we've bumped up against and that I keep hearing in the media is just, what exactly is Christian nationalism? And you take a good chunk of the book really drilling down into defining this. So we obviously don't have time to get into all the nuances that you cover. What's your working definition?
Yeah, I did work really hard to be kind of careful and nuanced in how I understood it. You know, it's like a fourth of the book is just defining terms. I take 3 whole chapters to work up to the definition. So I know a lot of people are kind of frustrated with the discourse around Christian nationalism. It's now become a buzzword. People sling it about. And so if you're looking for a careful discussion of the definition, then, you know, that's what I really tried to offer here. I think the shorthand is pretty simple. If you think that America is a Christian nation and the government has a role in keeping it that way, I think that's Christian nationalism. There's lots of ways you can interpret the statement, America's a Christian nation. We all know the history. We all know that a supermajority of Americans profess Christianity. There's a lot of overlap between Christian principles and the principles of the founding. It's all true, and I affirm that, and I celebrate it. But it's another step further to say that our government today should have the responsibility, prerogative, the power to sustain and defend and even enforce a specific religious cultural template for the nation. That's a step beyond, and it's certainly not conservative politically. And I actually don't think the Bible gives a jurisdiction to governments to do that kind of thing. I think it's pretty clear that the church and the state have separate jurisdictions.
Okay, so you're getting into your critique of Christian nationalism a little bit, and to oversimplify your argument, you basically say that Christian nationalism is both un-American and illiberal, and it's unchristian. So can we kind of take each of those in turn? What about Christian nationalism is contrary to the Constitution and just American values and ethics?
Yeah, so I think nationalism is inconsistent with the ideas of an open society, of the Constitution, the Declaration. Nationalism is giving the government the power to say who we are as a people, rather than giving us, the people, the opportunity to figure it out and invent it on our own. And so it's really giving the government quite a lot of power. When the government does that, it inevitably excludes some people out of its definition. If you say America's a Christian nation and we got to keep it that way, well, what does that say to people who aren't Christians? And what does it say to kind of dissidents, people who don't fit into the mainstream Christian tradition? Mainstream Christian tradition is Anglo-Protestantism, as Samuel Huntington says. And there's nothing, my critique here isn't that Anglo-Protestantism is evil. I'm not saying that. I am saying that it's only one culture among many, many cultures in America. So if you want to take that one thing and make it all of America, well, guess what? You're actually leaving out a lot of people. And as a Christian, I think it's inhospitable. It's uncharitable to define away many of our fellow Americans. And that's the most benign way of putting it. I think we all know that there is clearly more hostile, clearly more oppressive ways that governments can exclude, disenfranchise, and oppress people on the basis of race, language, ethnicity, culture, religion, what have you. And I'm concerned that nationalism, it can start with the seemingly benign versions of exclusion and gravitate, morph, evolve into the more hostile versions.
So you cite a survey early in the book that says 65% of Americans say it's fairly or very important that a citizen be a Christian to be truly American. That's a shockingly high number, 65%. And then 29%, a third of Americans say that the federal government should declare that the U.S. is a Christian nation. So these are not fringe ideas. These are not just the far right periphery.
Those polling numbers, I think, are about 4 or 5 years old now. I bet they're higher today,
right?
Because of the talk about Christian nationalism, people are now really embracing the label, and I bet those numbers have probably ticked up just this year.
Okay, speaking of embracing the label, when I first started bumping into this in recent discourse, political dialogue, it seemed like Christian nationalism was being thrown out there more by people on the left as a critique or a pejorative of religious conservatives on the right. Increasingly, however, I'm hearing religious conservatives on the right embrace the label almost like a form of linguistic jujitsu, where they're taking what was intended to be an insult and they're embracing it and celebrating. Of course, I'm a Christian nationalist. Is that what you see happening, or are people misunderstanding this label when they apply it to themselves in a celebratory way?
I definitely see that happening, and it's a rhetorical fight over who owns the label and who gets to define its terms. And frankly, they're both wrong, because you don't get to weaponize a label as an insult, nor do you get to own it as a triumphalist badge unilaterally. It actually has a scholarly meaning and a definition separate from the warring tribes. Right? Nationalism has been around for 2 centuries, and scholars have studied it for a long time, and it has a meaning separate from what the left and the right want it to mean. And when I say Christian nationalism, I'm just saying this is the particular kind or flavor of nationalism present in America today. So when people on the right brandish the label and say, well, I'm a nationalist because I love my country. Well, I'm sorry, but patriotism and nationalism are different things. And that's a kind of well-established. You can't just reinvent the meaning of words. Patriotism is good. I love my country. I have affection for it. This is my home. I'm very grateful for what a great country it is. That's patriotism, and we should all be patriots. And that's very different from nationalism, which is an argument about the identity of your country. what makes up your country, what your country is, what is the national identity there. And that's where it can get exclusive and problematic.
So later on in the book, at the chapter 7 or 8, you mention how the Christian right has always included a strong focus on nationalism. And you, from your definition earlier, this belief that America is a Christian nation and that the governmental powers should be used to maintain or further that, that's always been there. So what's different about what's happening now? Because I think some people would argue, if you take a time machine back to the 1980s or 1990s and the sort of Christian right activism we saw then is different somehow than what we're seeing today. And the label of Christian nationalism was not typically used in that era to describe the religious right, but a lot of people do use it today, and some on the religious right embrace it, like we said. So what's different between then and now? Or is it just a matter of degree, but the core is the same?
So I would identify two inflection points, one around 1965 or so, and the second one around 2016. Because you understand that the kind of political use of Christianity in America goes back to the first, the Puritan settlement of Massachusetts, right? So this is as old as America is. And for 300 years, the controversy wasn't using Christianity for political purposes. It was which brand of Christianity, right? Was it going to be the Puritans or was it going to be Roger Williams, right? Was it going to be more sectarian or a bit more kind of Enlightenment flavored and more kind of open and less denominational? 1965 is really kind of a convenient inflection point when you can say the country had grown pluralistic enough that there were enough Americans to say, well, maybe we're not a Christian nation, or maybe we don't want to define our country that way. So those who wanted to continue defining America as a Christian nation became more partisan. It used to be a bipartisan affair. Now it is more increasingly confined just to the Republican Party. At the same time, it becomes more defensive, right? Previously, the sort of Christian nation advocates were very optimistic and sort of post-millennial, wanted to build the kingdom of God on earth, and it's here in America. In recent decades, it's been more defensive, more reactionary, I'd say more pessimistic, and more partisan. The next inflection point, 2016, it really becomes the central question dividing Americans politically. And where you fall on this side of the line really says a lot of your tribal loyalties and your political agenda. And so, yeah, I'd say we're in a kind of a new chapter right now.
You talk at one point about the way that advocates of Christian nationalism often appeal to heritage as justification for their efforts. I'm thinking of stuff I've read and heard from people like Rod Dreher, Soheb Amari. Their argument is essentially that democracy and liberty cannot survive without the foundations of Christianity as a cultural framework. And the progressive agenda, they would argue, is undermining the roots of our civilization. And if we don't protect it, if we don't guard this heritage, especially the Christianity in our heritage, we're going to lose the whole thing. It'll all collapse. That argument, it's kind of appealing, or at least has some traction for people, because when you do look at some of the extreme positions on the left, it does feel like there's an energy around fundamentally redefining basic assumptions, whether it's gender identity issues, marriage, the self, all those things are being redefined on the extreme left. So the extreme right comes along and says, we need to protect these things and the Christian foundations of them, or we're going to lose the entire framework for our civilization. What do you see as flawed in that argument, this argument about heritage that these voices are getting wrong?
I do agree with the critique of the progressive left. And actually that is my next book. It kind of turns my attention leftward. It'll be something like The Religion of American Progress, What's Wrong with the Progressive Left. That's the working title.
You're just going to have no friends left, are you?
I don't have any now. So I agree with the concerns about the illiberality, the sort of the intellectual authoritarianism of the left. I think that's a true concern. But I think the solution, nationalism is not a solution that actually throws fuel on the fire. It is as bad as the disease it seeks to cure. And this is chapter 5 of the book for anyone who wants to pick it up. I see a symbiotic relationship between progressives and nationalists, between kind of identity politics on the left and nationalism on the right. I think nationalism is the identity politics of the majority tribe, right, of white Christians. And identity politics is the nationalism of small groups. In other countries, when at the CIA, when we analyzed other countries, we would just call it ethnic nationalism. That's what it is. And so here in America, we have rival nationalisms all over the place, rival identity politics all over the place. And so the right wing version of it, trying to impose the kind of Anglo-Protestant nationalism, is divisive because we're not all Anglo-Protestants. And it is impossible to unify the country around that vision. It's like the post-liberals on the right want to put the genie back in the bottle. They want to undo the pluralization of American culture.
Right.
Look, it's just not going to happen. It's impractical. It's impossible. And any effort to make it so is going to be inherently divisive and even oppressive to do so.
But isn't their agenda, you're right, they want to undo the pluralism of American culture, but they know they can't remove all of those people from American culture, but they do want to remove them from positions of influence and power in American culture. And that seems to be a satisfying enough victory for them if we can just make sure that the people wielding power are those Anglo-Protestants, then we'll be okay.
Yeah. And this kind of brings us to the question, do we need Christianity for democracy to survive?
Right.
No, we don't. And there's a bit in chapter 4 on this, drawn from some broader research I've done on the roots of democracy around the world. We all know that a liberal democracy or democracy and human rights, civic republicanism, did originate in its full-fleshed modern form in Anglo-Protestant England. That's a true statement. Does that mean it only works in Anglo-Protestant England? No, about half the world would disagree with that statement because about half the world is a functioning democracy today. It varies, and we're actually in a little bit of a democratic decline right now.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have functioning democracies in Japan and India and Namibia and Botswana and Tuvalu and Micronesia, it strains credulity to say you have to be a Christian society to sustain democracy. It's just not true. It's factually, empirically not true. Now, I like our democracy, and I'm a Christian, and I like seeing values like justice for all honored in the public square. It's not wrong for us Christians to advocate for ourselves, for public office, and for our ideals. That's not wrong at all. But don't mistake that for enshrining a predominance of Christianity under the false assumption that that is required for American democracy to survive, because that's not true.
Yeah, at one point you say Christian nationalism is in effect identity politics for tribal evangelicals who confuse their particular culture for the nation as a whole.
Yep.
So it seems like as white evangelicals are seeing the shrinking influence of their particular culture, they misinterpret that as the diminishment of America overall. And therefore they overreact and think the whole country is going to disappear just because my little piece of it may be shrinking in influence. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. And I want to be clear, the demographic decline is real.
Right.
There's very clear numbers about however you define it. Look, white Americans are a smaller percentage of the population now than ever before, even though still like 70%. And Christians are a smaller proportion, Protestants are a smaller proportion, white Protestants, smaller proportion. So the decline is real, but that is not intrinsically unjust. It's not intrinsically unjust for your tribe to shrink, unless you think your tribe has a monopoly on virtue.
Right.
And there's the problem. I think many people feel, understandably, a little insecure when their tribe shrinks, because you know that you're now a little bit vulnerable to other tribes and their values, and that can feel it's a novel sensation for American white Christians because we've always been in charge, so to speak. So this is a new social location for us, and I think this transition period is going to be a period of some tumult.
Okay, so that brings up a topic that I actually want to reference from Twitter. So there is a Twitter troll who I won't give more oxygen to, who recently said that white Christian nationalism is not a real thing. It doesn't exist in America, and it poses no threat to democracy. And the fearmongers who've built a cottage industry by peddling fake studies, social science, and history on this are mostly liars. So this person's saying white Christian nationalism does not exist. My co-host, Phil Vischer, responded to this with a question on Twitter. He said, when Lauren Boebert says that the church should be directing the government, how do you think she would feel if a black church or Latino church was directing the U.S. government? Would she be okay with the government being directed by the priorities of the black or Latino community? All that to say, is Christian nationalism synonymous with white Christian nationalism, or is this a non-racialized identity? And how would you respond to somebody who says this thing doesn't exist? This white Christian nationalism is a fiction.
Yeah. This is a really complicated and sensitive question. And I do try to address it in a few places in the book. And I took 6 years to choose my words carefully in the book, and now I have to remember it all on the fly on the air. Is Christian nationalism racist? Right? If you just listen to the stated beliefs, if you take it at face value, if you look at the advocates and hear what they say, they're not saying overtly racist things, and they're not saying only whites should be in charge. Like, they're not saying that. Okay, so let's acknowledge that there's a lack of that overt racism. Now, you asked a different question: is it racialized? And I think that's probably where the conversation gets more complicated. Christian nationalism in America is almost entirely located in the white community or white American community, right? It is true that those who espouse, this is where the work of Whitehead and Perry come in, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead and all their statistical work, those who espouse Christian nationalism, look at those beliefs. It is strongly correlated with a host of other beliefs that are, I think racialized is the right word to say for it. And they go into the details here in the statistics, but for example, if you just poll all Americans and say, when a police officer shoots an unarmed African-American, essentially, whose fault is it? And on average, Americans say something. Christian nationalists are more likely than the average American to say it's the African-American's fault. It's a small example of how Christian nationalism seems to be correlated with, associated with, the kinds of attitudes, beliefs, or postures that you might call racially insensitive, or less willing to take account of the realities of intergenerational racial inequality, or something like that. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, but beyond just the race thing in particular, when we use the term Christian nationalism, or when people embrace it and celebrate it as an identity, they have a very monolithic, narrow definition of what they mean by Christian, because there's a lot of different forms of Christianity around the world, and certainly in the United States. And these are generalizations, but the Latino church, the Black church, the Asian church, the Roman Catholic church, the Mennonite church, the Roman, I mean, all these, they have very, very different ways of being Christian that manifest themselves differently, culturally, politically, and otherwise. But when people use the term Christian nationalism, it seems they have in mind a very white, very Anglo, very evangelical vision of Christianity. So they're not advocating for the Black church tradition and theology to be steering the country. They're advocating for their white Anglo Protestant vision of Christianity should be steering the country. So you're right, it's not overtly racial, but it's implied in their assumptions that the Christianity, which is true Christianity, is the white Protestant evangelical Christianity that they're advocating for.
Let me engage with Samuel Huntington, who I do in chapter 3. He's a scholar who wrote this book entitled "Who Are We?" And he's the one who used the phrase Anglo-Protestantism. To be very clear that he was talking about culture, not race. And he claimed that any human can assimilate to an Anglo-Protestant culture. You don't have to be white, you don't have to be Christian, but to be American, you should be Anglo-Protestant in your culture. So again, if we just take that at face value, you can say, okay, it's a deracialized argument, it's not racist. To the extent that what you were just saying, that people have a specific idea in mind of what kind of Christian they mean, yeah, I think that they often mean an culturally Anglo-Protestant Christian,
right?
Whether you're Anglo, whether you're Protestant or not. I want to reemphasize that it's kind of empirically demonstrable that those who hold to this view, which they claim is deracialized, clearly do not see or do not recognize or deny the existence of the inherited systemic racialized inequalities in American life. It's almost as if Christian nationalism goes along with, again, either an unwillingness or inability to see those inequalities, and therefore they don't recognize it as a problem to be solved. They think the solution is only individual or lies wholly within the culture of the African American community. And therefore, their vision of a Christian nation can coexist with existing racial inequalities. and they see no contradiction or tension between existing racial inequality and being a Christian nation. That's how it can be most troubling, I think, and most, I would say, racially insensitive.
Does this get back to your idea again about heritage versus history? Because obviously the heritage of the United States is one of racial inequality, and people who romanticize that heritage don't feel like that's anything that was all that bad that we need to overcome. Whereas the history takes a more objective analysis of what the American past was, compares it to our founding documents and our ideals, and says, no, we have improvements to make here. And we ought to be grateful for things we've inherited from the past, but we're not beholden to them. And we need to, in some ways, reform them. Whereas those who make an idol out of their heritage don't tend to reform or review what they've inherited as being problematic. Is that a fair way of putting it?
With a few tweaks.
Okay.
To be fair, I think that the Christian nationalist would certainly say that our national sins in the past were bad. Like, they're not going to minimize that, unless maybe you're Doug Wilson writing about the virtues of how slavery wasn't that bad, right? Okay, so there's a few voices out there. But by and large, I think Christian nationalists will readily say, look, our national sins were bad. Where the difference is how much work do we have left to do to overcome, to continue onward, to make amends for the past, to rectify the existing inequalities that have a root in long past oppression. And I think the Christian nationalists do tend to say, we've done the work, like it's kind of done, and the rest is up to the individual. And it's not really a matter for public policy, not a matter for the nation. I think that tends to be the posture. Whereas the other position is, no, we actually have quite a lot of work to do, and the government should step in and do something here.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to get to, towards the end of the book, chapter 10, you have an interesting conversation or discussion about the difference between nationalism and nationality. I think this is where some people who are embracing the nationalist language are using, like you said earlier, they're co-opting, redefining a term because they think it's a positive thing and they're ignoring its historic definitions. What is the difference between nationalism and nationality, or to use what you said earlier, what's a healthy approach to the way we think about our country that nationalism distorts?
When I criticize nationalism, I'm not criticizing the existence of nations, and I'm not calling for one world government, right? I'm not, that's, and very few people do. There's a few radicals out there, but like the whole critique against globalists is greatly overdrawn. There's hardly any globalists out there. We have nationalities. I think that's true, and I think it's even in Scripture, right? God set the boundaries for the peoples and all that. But God didn't say that our boundaries of our culture have to overlap exactly with the boundaries of our politics and that sort of thing. The fact that we exist in different nations is fine. It's not a bad thing. It's not intrinsically unjust. And that's why I can be a patriot. I can love my particular country for what it is, for being my home, and for being a great example of liberty and equality for the whole world to see. Nationalism is an argument about our national identity, like who gets to say what our nation is, what is the defining attribute of our nation. Nationalism is an argument about national identity. So they are different things, and I think that we can celebrate being a part of a nation, loving our country, without falling into the pitfalls of nationalism.
At the very end of the book, you have a brief segment about what pastors and church leaders, what responsibility they have in this discussion, because it is filling our churches, at least in a lot of evangelicalism. What advice do you give to people with some level of spiritual influence in a church or community around these topics?
Number one, rebuke falsehood and heresy when you hear it. Don't let it go by unaddressed. There are many falsehoods out there about our political environment, about, for example, the 2020 election, and falsehood needs to be rebuked, right? So rebuke falsehood. And that's just to all people, all Christians, all humans should do that, as well as church leaders. So rebuke falsehood, and don't teach this stuff. Don't teach nationalism. But more broadly, I do think that our evangelical culture has often absorbed the individualism of of America, of American culture. And so you hear a lot of sermons by faithful pastors who are preaching the word and treating it with great respect. They draw out the meaning of a text, and then they apply it to you as an individual and maybe to you in your family life. And that's about where the sermon stops, many times. And I think that the gospel has implications for much beyond that. I don't want to fall into the trap of overemphasizing the cultural aspects, right? That's been done before, social gospel stuff. But look, if the gospel starts essentially on page 1 with creation, God made a good creation, and it ends on the last page with God renewing creation, then we should understand, we live out our Christian lives, that it should go from creation to new creation. It's not just about my individual piety and my family life. It's about everything I do, all of who I am, every act, every role, every relationship, every institution I belong to. I'm a Christian there. And so I should work for flourishing, justice, liberty, equality, peace, and goodness wherever I am. And I think that I would love to hear pastors preach that full-orbed implications of the gospel.
Amen. I would too. The challenge in that, of course, is when pastors get up and start talking about those wider, more communal dimensions and applications of the gospel, they get accused of preaching politics, which is silly, but it's a threat that keeps many of them silent.
And so to be clear, the problem isn't that we're talking about politics too much or too little. There's not a dial here, and we should dial it up or dial it down. We should talk about politics not in a partisan way necessarily. We don't need single issue preachers who will preach the gospel and then also the pro-life sermon, right? Our social, political, cultural lives are much bigger than that. And so essentially every sermon can include some commentary on something broader than just our individual and family and church life. That's kind of what I'm getting at. I know it's a little bit vague, but I kind of want to hand the baton over to the pastors and the seminarians to kind of figure out the next step. I don't want to be in the business of telling you how to do your jobs. I'm just a layman here. But I do think that there is probably something here for church leaders to step into.
Well, you call yourself a layman, but you are an academic, and you've written a really super thoughtful, nuanced book about Christian nationalism that I think pastors and church leaders should be engaging. I mean, this is the intellectually robust conversation on the topic that we need to be having, not just the sound bites we get in so much of the media. Paul Miller, thank you so much for the book. Again, it's called The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. You're going to stick around for a few minutes because we're going to have another conversation. Your expertise is in foreign affairs. You worked in the White House on that front. You still teach on that front. And so we're going to have a brief conversation about what's going on in Ukraine. And you wrote a piece recently in the Dispatch talking about how this is the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I believe President Biden has echoed that comment as well. So we're going to talk about that.
2 days after I published the piece, he did.
Yes. So for our Patreon supporters, thank you for keeping the Holy Post going. And you can check out that conversation on our website. And Paul, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.